All right. Today, I want to take a slightly different approach to something which is really a really basic issue in sort of philosophical discussions. And so the title of this video is The Common World. And so what I want to think about is this concept of the common world, the world that we all share, and how that concept sort of gets involved in certain philosophical problems. I suspect that we might be able to diagnose some misunderstandings, that the language causes us to have some intuitions about the common world that we all share that might make it seem more mysterious than it is. The key to I have this little piece of paper here. I'll get rid of it as soon as I say the couple things I want to say to start. First of all, the real issue here, I think at the end of the day, what matters is the issue of whether you have a representational theory of mind. That is, whether or not your model of mental function and nervous system function, maybe, if you will, I guess you might have to have it be that way, involves representations, mental representations. Broadly speaking, we might use that adjective Cartesian to describe, although I'm not sure Descartes himself is actually guilty of this. But the idea that what you're experiencing is a mental representation of the world and not the world itself. I said guilty, maybe that's, that's the issue. So the issue really is the issue of mental representation, the status, I think, of theories of mind that are representational theories of mind. And of course, this has to do with the inner and the outer, the public and the private, the mental and the physical. And we will see, as I say, it has everything to do with skepticism. I think skepticism is interesting because it may be that we have actually managed to philosophically overcome some versions of skepticism to some extent. But in this case, specifically, we'll be talking about the skeptical problem of the external world, in as much as the skeptic might ask us to prove that we know that the external world exists. Okay, so let's just get on with our presentation then. I'll just cue this up. Sorry, I'm still awkward with this after all this time. So yeah, skeptical intuitions, and then let me explain the big words here, and an extrasubjective being. So, so the idea then is that, well, you're experiencing things and I'm experiencing things. You're looking out the window and I'm looking out the window. You're tasting the spaghetti sauce and I'm tasting the spaghetti sauce. But then somehow there's the notion that we have this shared world that we're both in. That is, we're not solipsists. And I'm going to talk about Wittgenstein's appropriation of that word a little bit later. We don't think we're the only people having experiences. But then remember, the issue is, well, if I think I'm just having my own mental representation, my own mental experience of the world that's kind of private to me, then that skeptical problem arises. So it would seem about whether or not only are my experiences similar to the experiences of others, but what is the relationship between my mental representation of the world and the world itself, the world in itself. And we're going to talk about, for example, Kant a little bit, who was into that question. And then, so skeptical intuitions, and I can, I can be right up front about one. I mean, a basic one, and that's going to be that you have the intuition that if you can see this world, then like in the Matrix, somehow this visual experiencing or generally sensory experience that you're having might fall away and be replaced by another one. And once we realize that that can't be what the claim is, then that also tells us something about this concept that we have about a common world and what that common world is like. Again, I want to talk about the nature of the common world, this concept of the common world. So skeptical intuition is an extrasubjective being, I say there on the slide. Extrasubjective being, not intersubjective being. You might think we could approach the common world that way. That is, we think in empiricism, for example, that maybe there's, we have intersubjective agreement, right? We claim everybody says, yes, there were 13 blinks or whatever. But here, of course, what we're talking about is if there's anything we can say about extrasubjective being, that is, being as it exists independently of being the object of any subjective experience, I guess is the way we could put that. So skepticism in the common world. First of all, the first bullet point there, let me just define philosophical skepticism. Of course, we have a more quotidian sense of skepticism, but in philosophy, skepticism, often this is usually part of epistemology, but the idea will be that the philosophical skeptic is the skeptic who's telling you that they can show that you don't know something that you're absolutely certain that you do know. Absolutely certain, even that doesn't quite grasp what makes it philosophical. Absolutely certain in these kinds of ways. You're absolutely certain that you have a body. You're absolutely certain that I'm another person. You're absolutely certain that you're awake right now. And so on. These are the kinds of things that you're absolutely certain of, not the kinds of things you might rhetorically say that you're absolutely certain of about sort of quotidian states of affairs in your life. Rather, these kinds of absolute certainty. As I say, I guess there's a little more work to do to characterize exactly what that philosophical difference is from being absolutely certain that the keys are downstairs. I guess I'm not absolutely certain if the keys are downstairs. But anyway, let's move on to the next bullet point. See, there's plenty of work to be done here. And so this very common version of skepticism is skepticism about the external world. And that's one of my targets here in sort of doing a little bit of analysis of this concept of the common world and seeing what we can really say and maybe cannot say about the common world. So the most second bullet point on the slide, the most common version of skepticism is skepticism of the external world. The thing that's going on between Descartes and Hume, you see, is that Descartes, the mathematician, says that you have to show that something's logically necessary. You have to show that your conclusion follows by logical necessity from the premises in order to say that you know it. Under which epistemology, unsurprisingly, it turns out that as Descartes saw, you know really very, very little. And Hume follows along and pretty much goes along through Descartes, showing that, in fact, Descartes has a pretty bizarre notion of knowledge under which, yes, indeed, we know basically nothing. And Hume makes the reasonable point that since we have to use the verb to know all the time, then maybe it's not real helpful to say that in almost none of those cases do we have actual knowledge. The difference between rational and reasonable, right? I would say on the third bullet point that all of the early modern philosophers, whether you call them rationalists or empiricists from Descartes through Kant, I think they all have something to say about this question of mental representations. And I think they all want to say that all of them, maybe with the exception of Descartes himself, want to say that we really are not stuck in the skeptical problem that this kind of representational model suggests that we are. And I'm not sure how I feel about that myself. So let's talk about the empiricists. Let's talk about Berkeley and Hume. Berkeley, of course, a notorious idealist. In this case, what does that mean? That the idealist is someone who's making the metaphysical claim that only the mental exists. So it's a special use of that word idealism. And yet at the same time, Berkeley we think of as an empiricist. So why is that? Well, because Berkeley took very seriously this empiricist dictum that all knowledge is based on experience. So Berkeley is kind of a way to figure out why Berkeley says what sounds, if it's taken out of context, to be a very strange thing, that everything is mental somehow, is that Berkeley's looking at this, this epistemological skeptical problem that mental representation brings to the table. That is, Berkeley says, okay, gang, so you've got this inner mental and you've got this outer physical. And your big question mark, your big skeptical question mark is you don't know how this inner mental lines up or relates to this outer physical. And that's your skeptical problem. That's your epistemological problem. But, Berkeley goes on, gang, listen, gang, you say that you know everything that you know by virtue of your experiences. And you furthermore then say that what it is that you experience are this what you're calling your mental representation of the world. That's the problem, right? That you don't know how that relates to this real world that you're talking about. But if, after all, your dictum is that your knowledge is based on your experience, then you really don't have anything to do with this real world the so-called real external physical world at all, that's the thing you should drop. And then the problem disappears. I mean, that's his spirit. That's what he's trying to do, is make the problem go away. And in this, with this very good kind of argument. So when I say experience is everything, you can call it whatever you like, matter, schmatter, mental, schmental. It's something that people miss, I think, about the empiricists, is that the term experience is not assigned to the inner or the outer or the mental or the physical, when the empiricist says that all knowledge is based on experience, even if they add on sensory experience, which is quite a qualifier, but even so. And I think Berkeley and Hume largely agree with that. I say in the third bullet point there, I think Hume kind of scrubs out Berkeley's rather strange way of putting it, or rather, I would say, paradoxical way of putting it, with his idealist language. But basically, if you said to Hume, okay, you say, I have my private experience and you have your private experience, private, right? But what about the world that we share? Hume would say, in terms of these experiences that you're appealing to, in terms of your experience of the world, my experience of the world, we don't have any experience of anything that looks like a common world like that. That is a common world as distinct from our own experiences. And so Hume says, if you talk to him about the common world, he'd say, I don't think you can really talk. I don't think there is anything like that. Just as if you said to Hume, what about causation? He'd say, well, I mean, I see all the conjunctions and so on, but I mean, if you want to add something onto that, just like freedom, just like mind, Hume won't have any of that stuff, just like substance even. He won't even have substance. So yeah, Hume's right there with Berkeley, right, in terms of that. But notice that if everything collapses into experience, the way Berkeley does it is say, the way the materialist wants to do is say that everything's physical, and then that's got its problems. Berkeley says, let's just say everything's mental, which has its problems, I guess, but it's the same effect. And Hume says, look, everything is based on experience. And it's only within the context of that you can talk about these metaphysical and epistemological questions. And I think that's something that Kant gets from Hume. I think that's where Hume and Kant sort of take it up to another level here. But as I say, on that third bullet point, Hume has no problem cheerfully, just as Hume is always cheerful about these radical positions that he takes. He says that's just a pseudo problem. There's no grounds for positing anything like a common world. And that, the thing I want to say here, I guess, ultimately is that, you've got the world of phenomena. Again, Kant understands this very well. You've got the world of phenomenal experience, but if you're talking about the common world, whatever that is, whatever we're talking about, that's not a world that could be phenomenally experienced, since any phenomenal experience is just by definition apparently not common, I guess, or something like that. We're going to go after some other positions. These guys. Right. So the last thing I want to say then, that and I think this is important, is why I hesitated there. The thing about Berkeley and Hume that's really important to understand, it's really important to understand this about Hume, is that they're not cheerleaders for naturalism or materialism or something like that. In fact, not at all. Look at Berkeley. Berkeley says, no, this outer physical world that you're talking about, that's the thing that looks to me like you don't have any grounds for talking about it. And Hume has, got very, very much the same kind of attitude. As I say, you can take experience, you can either say collapse it into the mental or collapse it into the physical, but I think the fact is that both the mental and the physical ideally collapse into the concept of experience, and that's the bridge, that the external world is experience and that you are experience, and there's the oneness, I think that's pretty clear in Hume. So we want to talk about Kant. You got to be careful. He's deceptively good at all of this, and he understands the problems really well. But Kant looks at Hume. He doesn't like what he sees, because Hume says, look, Again, Hume's kind of the happy warrior about all this. Hume says, look, there's no evidence, there's no empirical evidence for God or for there being any values or any such things as souls or minds, a bundle theory of content for the mind, or freedom. Again, if you mean by some occult power, like you do with causation, I don't see anything like that. Of course, he's just trying to sort of shut metaphysics down, right? I mean, like a lot of modern and contemporary philosophers always think that they're going to shut it all down. They're the end of the line. So, second bullet point: the phenomenal world of empirical science, Kant said, was a mental representation. It wasn't really Descartes, I think, in fairness to Descartes, who left us in what is commonly called this Cartesian dilemma, where we're sort of like in the Men in Black movie, where we're sort of our little selves kind of mind body dualistically kind of in our heads, but not of it kind of thing. I mean, that's what we need the therapy for, right? To get over that. And Kant, I think, understands that pretty well. He says, look, Kant famously, right, says, what has to be possible for experience to be possible? I can ask that question. And then, his response is, well, then there's got to be a conceptual structure. People forget how radical the conceptual structure of Kant really is. I think Kant has been overly digested, really. But the strategy was that he could show that if Kant could show that the world that science studies is a mental representation, in specifically the world as it is constructed by these sort of conceptual categories of the mind, then that left room for talking about the world as it is independently of being represented. And of course, Kant very carefully says you can't do traditional metaphysics because you're just stuck within your conceptual structure of the mind. However, Kant did think that you could show on rational grounds, and in particular by appeal to the very fact of rationality itself, that really, literally, that soul, freedom, and morality could be shown to exist. So last bullet point then, though, just to reiterate that about Kant, because the big thing about Kant is he's the one who's really saying what you're experiencing is a mental representation. And here I notice I call this slide Kant and Parmenides. I'm not going to get lost in the weeds with Parmenides, although I think there's a video of him here somewhere. But look at what Kant says are conceptual categories that are imposed by the mind in the construction of the phenomenal experience. Space and time. Space and time aren't real, Kant says. Not only does Kant say that cause and effect relations are also projections, but he says that the multiplicity of objects is part of the conceptual structure that makes the world an intelligible place for a human being. So what you have left, if you see that Kant says all those things are projections, you're trying to think about the world in itself, the common world, then he says something it sounds like Parmenides. Schopenhauer is kind of obsessed with this. He thinks music is the window onto this Parmenidean world. But what's the Parmenidean world? Parmenides who said nothing could not be anything that couldn't be any different from anything else, because that would be a negative quality and they didn't exist. Well, it's a unity. It's not a whole made up of parts. It can't be divisible. So there's no surface, no time or space, no properties. I mean, I can kind of think of a big black bowling ball kind of shining in the cosmic dark there, but even that's just a representation and it can't be represented because the representation has like a surface, it can be divided, et cetera, et cetera. So then, he says, look, that obviously can't be the object of the mental representation. So Kant, notice, like Hume, Kant also is not stuck with this Cartesian problem. I mean, they both have their reasons for just thinking that it's not the case that I have to worry about the relationship between my mental representation and the world as it is. And in Kant's particularly, I think that's a very sophisticated version, that is that the world as it is independently of mental representations. And finally, I want to talk about the sort of linguistic version of these empirical arguments by Wittgenstein. Again, Wittgenstein and the empiricists like Hume and Berkeley are very similar. Wittgenstein very much in that position, and also doing this really good kind of conceptual analysis that Kant is so good at doing. So Wittgenstein's basic technique is he's going to look for elements of grammar just to be a little entree in that. So trying to think about psychology with a language that evolved to deal with three-dimensional objects in three-dimensional space, out hunting mastodons with spears or I don't know, whatever. And then, so sure enough, you're going to have this very figurative psychological vocabulary where the mind is a kind of an inner space and it's got contents. And these are things that we refer to using nouns. They're the objects of sentences, all these beliefs and desires that I have, like the nickels and the dimes that I have. So you see how Wittgenstein starts to sort of massage you with the language there and show you that maybe some of these things are these mental formations that are actually caused by what he would call the metaphysical grammar of the language. Wittgenstein's not the end of the world, folks, but I would say in terms of perceiving that, at least, I mean, he's given some very useful and good things. You should understand what he says. So here's the second bullet point. This is really basic, and this I take it to be basically a Wittgensteinian response to the problem of skepticism. For example, the problem of skepticism about the external world. And for my money, I think this actually looks to me that this argument kind of does the trick. I mean, you have to ask that question for yourself, but I'm just suggesting to you to look at the second bullet point, and then and I'm going to explain it to you right now, and then you tell me. So let me step out of it to do it for a second even. So it's like this. I mean, you ask me, do I know where my car keys are? And that makes sense, right? I mean, you're asking me a coherent question. I understand what you're asking me. And that's because it's true that I might know where my car keys are. I should know where they are. But it's also true that I might not know where they are. Right? So that's the informational payoff. I mean, you ask me, do I know where my car keys are? And you may have a reason, a pragmatic reason for wanting to know whether I know where my car keys are. And notice also it's possible that I might think I know where my car keys are, but I'm wrong. I didn't know where my car keys were. And it's because we're in that situation where there is actually information that can come between us that has, functional, that can motivate us. That's why we say it's meaningful to say something like that. Do I know where my car keys are? But if you say, do I know that the external world exists? I mean, the question is, well, what would count for it to exist or not to exist? It looks like I know everything else that I know sort of in the context of the external world. In fact, it turns out to be a pseudo problem because I am not in appropriate circumstances to use the verb to know. There are these criteria in which it's coherent to use the verb to know. Do you know where your car keys are? Do you know if those people are coming tonight? Do you know where the auditorium is? These are functional questions. Do you know that the external world exists? Is not. So getting back to the slide then. To the slide here. Right, here's the right answer to the skeptic. It's the last bullet point. And as I say, to me, I don't know, this is the argument that as to skepticism impresses me the most, which is just this. I mean, the way Wittgenstein puts it is it's like a card trick. So the trick has been set up before the person who's going to play the trick has fixed up the card deck even before they've even approached you and offered to show you a trick. It's already over before it's even begun because they have already arranged things in such a way that the trick will happen. And the skeptic's trick happens right at the beginning when they get you to agree. Notice this is what Descartes does. They get you to agree to a actually quite unnatural and irregularly high standard of certainty, and then it turns out that you're not certain of much of anything. Again, Hume saw that as the weakness of Descartes' position, because after all, we do know things, and so it's not very helpful when you just simply tell us that we don't. Knowing things is the datum. So, all right. So the problem is, if I think that something's meaningful to the extent that there is some function that can be performed by my saying it, by my using it, if that's that functional role, semantics, right? That's a certain theory of that mysterious property of meaning. Then it doesn't look like I neither know nor do not know. I don't. It's not an object of knowledge. I don't know or not know that the external world exists. It's not the kind of thing that you know or don't know. Oh, so you don't know it? No, I didn't say that. It's incorrect to say I don't know it, because it's not the kind of thing that one knows or doesn't know, unless you want to get stuck in that silly semantic loop. But that's it. That also it. No. So yeah, I think this is the last one then. The characterization of the common world. Now, this is a thing I want to talk about. I just reviewed some philosophy. I sang for my supper. But then getting to this, I mean, this is the idea here. The basic problem we have thinking about the common world is that we think of a world as a world of experience. We imagine that we have to be talking about a world that is at least a world of potential experience. I could potentially experience. There could be an alternative experience. At least that's the way the language leads us. Something there suggests we think about the common world. I've got my world, you've got your world, but there's a common world. And that language just strongly suggests to us that there's another world where we could sort of meet. But second bullet point, the common world, think of the common world like the average person. There is no, I just met the average person. There is no average person. The common world has no representational existence. Oh, how do I want to say that? There's information structures that we have. Most of these, it used to be just mostly in books and in people's minds, of course. Nowadays, it's kind of a big structure. And that's important because, what I say, that's the common world. That there isn't a common world or it's an illusion. No, but the common world is not the object of any experience. So the common world, if you want to read about the common world, read history books. Of course, when you read novels, you're reading about the common world in as much as you can make generalizations and universalizations about what you read in them. And science, physics books, geology books, chemistry books, biology books, astrophysics books. Those are about the common world. That is, those are these informational constructions, these linguistic artifacts that we've constructed that we call history and science. But that's it, actually. And, there isn't anything else, because the only place where there's any phenomenal experience is an individual in a body experiencing what individuals experience. You can say experience what it's like to be in the body, but I think that's kind of misleading. Just experiencing being a body, just experiencing being a body, just being a body. And there isn't any other world that's like that. If you mean by that, it's some world I could go to. So that's the thing. So what I'm inviting everyone to think about, if we're talking about skepticism in the external world and so on, is this concept of the common world. I mean, what is this common world? Are we blind to the common world? Are we hidden from the common world? No, we're not. I guess the idea was that, well, I have my mental representation of the common world and you have yours, but the real common world, we're stuck behind our mental representations, but there isn't anything else other than our mental representations insofar as experience is concerned. Okay, and that means that they're not actually mental representations, because they're not actually representations of something else. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I want to say we have sort of direct perception of reality, because I don't think the notion of mental representation is coherent, and that there's a lot of material in here about that. But I mean, that's sort of a driving notion of mine. But the exercise today was to think about, that notion of the common world and what you mean by the common world, and the realization that to some extent, when we talk about any kind of phenomenal experience, we're not talking about a common world. But anyway, something like that. Okay. Bye-bye.